Rule number 5, the sequence of play of the Third World War. This is really the most complex part of the game. The mechanics themselves are fairly simple. The ground combat mechanic, the air combat, the supply mechanisms, and later we'll talk about the nuclear component. So these are the initial phases. We've got a diplomacy phase where countries join. In this particular simulation, there's a 1 in 3rd chance that Yugoslavia will join NATO on turn 1, and then a further 1 in 3rd chance that Yugoslavia will join NATO on game turn 4. Sweden will join the game automatically on game turn 3, and there are variable entry conditions for both Sweden and Finland if the Soviets go through those parts of Finland and Sweden that are north of the Arctic Circle. Albania has no chance of entering the game unless it's been invaded by either side. The aircraft maintenance phase, we spoke about that before. Aircraft, you receive new air units in the particular base. The American aircraft can go in any of the 7 air theaters that they want. Aircraft are randomly destroyed according to how many craters were indicated, and aircraft are grounded according to how many craters are indicated. Then craters are repaired, and there's a consolidation of loss, and that's where 50% of the aircraft in that turn are rescued and put back in the flown box. In other words, they've been repaired, and the rest are permanently destroyed. There's then rolling for the weather, which can either create clear weather or overcast storm or severe storm, which are progressively worsening effects on aircraft performance. There's a restraint phase. All nuclear decisions will be restrained to the Soviet German commander and the NATO German commanders, and they will decide whether they want to push the use of nuclear weapons or restrain the nuclear weapons, and it's really for them to read those rules. Then there's the theater air superiority phase. The Warsaw Pact placed their aircraft, and all countries allied with the Warsaw Pact, and then NATO responds. So NATO's got a bit of flexibility because they can concentrate their aircraft in adjacent theaters and then have an effect on achieving air superiority. There's then the deep strike phase where the Soviet Union assigns deep logistical strikes. We talked about those to hit the supply lines. They do runway creating, and they provide escort missions for those aircraft. NATO may intercept those missions, and then it can also assign deep logistical strikes, runway creating, and escort missions. The Warsaw Pact can then intercept those missions, and then all of the air combat is resolved. Then all of the air defense fire is resolved, and then the ground attack missions are conducted. So you can see it's a fairly compact process. I should have mentioned before, each air unit represents 100 aircraft of that type. So there's a fair number of airplane pieces in the game. The supply phase, you determine how many packed brigades are unsupplied. This could be the result of the logistic attack. Plus, it could be the result of the Warsaw Pact being on turn 7 or later. NATO chooses which ones. Now, if the Soviets, this is then reversed. The Soviets, if they've inflicted any logistical strikes on NATO, NATO then designates brigades. Now, once NATO brigades are designated by the Soviets as unsupplied, you can do what's called emergency supply, which is you supply the unit that you want supplied. In other words, you take the unsupplied indicator off of it, and then you have to, in turn, unsupply twice as many units that you put into supply. So almost always, the Soviets will unsupply your units at the front, so you want to keep that unit in supply, and then you get to unsupply units in the rear. But remember, units in the rear that are unsupplied cannot regroup. In other words, they cannot shed their disruption markers. Then you do a critical loss determination phase. Some countries will become shaken or broken as a consequence. Their military units will not be able to perform. They'll be restricted to retreat back into their own country. These are in the rules that you should read. This affects some of the smaller countries. Countries like the U.S. are not affected by this. So we start with the pact segment, in which the Norwegian Sea Control chart is consulted. This is the chart right here, and it's affected by how many airfields that the Soviets control in Norway. It's meant to represent the use of heavy bombers to interfere with resupplies from North America. And then there's a Black Sea Fleet sortie phase, where you check for whether the Soviets and their allies have captured Istanbul/Constantinople, and thereby been able to get their fleet into the Aegean. and whether they can consequently conduct amphibious operations in the Aegean as a consequence. All right, so those are the only two naval phases. And then there's in the pact segment, there's strike interdiction phase, where you strike on the map. You put disruption markers on top of units located on the map. Pact declares strikes and escorts. NATO intercepts and declares strikes and escorts. The Pact then intercepts those. You resolve the air missions. You resolve the air defense fire, and then you've got the missions themselves that are conducted. So it's very similar to the deep strike missions that we were discussing before. Now we get into the ground combat. And here, this is a sort of a multi-echelon Soviet style of combat that is captured by the asymmetry in how the Warsaw Pact and NATO fight. The Soviets have a first echelon subphase where they move their units, and these include air transport, naval transport, and these are specified in greater detail in the rules. And then after their movement, they do combat. And it basically follows the steps that we saw before, which is the Pact will declare all the ground missions, and they'll put top cover missions on top of their units to protect them. NATO will then declare ground attack and top cover missions. So it'll protect its own units and attack Pact units. And then the Soviets can then put more top cover missions down in case some NATO units appeared. Both units can assign NAPs, which are nuclear attack points, depending on the nuclear attack level, and so you can have artillery exchanges with nuclear weapons. Air combat is then resolved, and air defense is resolved, and this combat is conducted. Now you have a second echelon breakthrough phase, and this the only units that can participate are those units that are not in a zone of control. So in theory, you would have punched a hole in your target enemy, created a gap, and then you can pass units through it, who then do an immediate attack on the second level of NATO forces behind. Now, doing this is much more difficult in practice, yeah. So and then you've got the movement phase for that and the combat phase for that, which here is abstracted because it's already been broken down in the segment above. Then you've got the NATO reserve impulse. Now, what NATO can do here is those NATO units that are not in enemy zone of control can then maneuver, probably to plug a hole before the next wave of Soviet attacks. So NATO would move. They cannot use air or naval transport, and then NATO will do a counterattack, a quick counterattack. You would resolve the attacks one by one, and here again is exactly the same breakdown of combat as it is up here. So the Soviets have attacked once, they've moved through, then they do another attack and push through again, then NATO does its reserve. This is essentially how you go through. And then you got NATO does a regrouping phase, which is those units that did not move or attack in the reserve impulse that are not in enemy zone of control can get their suppression markers removed. Then the Soviets have a second impulse. In other words, they get to do this whole thing over again. So the Soviets have an opportunity to attack once and twice with a NATO counterattack, and then another third and fourth attack. So the Soviet attack is relentless. However, can they actually pull it off? Can they actually have echelons that are not in zones of control? Will they have enough forces? That's a big question. So now we go to the NATO segment of the turn, which is different. It starts off with the strike interdiction phase. It's identical to the one in the Pact segment earlier on. This is the strike interdiction phase here in the Pact segment. This is basically attacking targets on the map. So here it's not detailed. NATO has its first impulse where NATO units are moved. Then NATO attacks. And this is the air combat for resolving that, including nuclear weapons. And then you've got a regrouping phase. So NATO's able to regroup. And NATO has got two regrouping phases in each turn, where the Warsaw Pact has only one. So NATO and American Western allies have a greater opportunity to heal themselves, and they should definitely take every opportunity to achieve it. Then NATO does a second impulse. They do another move and another attack. So NATO's got 3 opportunities to attack, and it's really only 2. So in the overall turn, Warsaw Pact attacks 4 times, NATO will attack 3 times, but NATO has 2 opportunities to recoup, and the Warsaw Pact has only 1. Then there's the surrender phase to see which countries surrender. And then we have the final segment where aircraft are landed, Aircraft in the air superiority box are put into the flown box, or they can be transferred. Units that came back from a previous mission can fly to an adjacent area if they're medium or long or unlimited range. Pack air units transfer first. Unsupplied units are returned to being in supply mode. You check for overland communication, make sure that Romania isn't blocking supplies to Bulgaria, and then you roll for escalation. Again, that's exclusively for those in West Germany who are making a decision as to how they're going to affect the fate of everyone else. You can only use nuclear weapons if you're one of the major powers. I'll detail that rule later on, and it's basically on a first come, first served basis for the nuclear weapons.